It's been such unusual and interesting timing in terms of all of the global implications of the tariff war, the trade war, the secondary effects of what happens to China, and of course Australia's exposure too. Do you think that's played into the gains that we've seen made by the government? Because we have seen sort of coming back against Trump's policies benefit other Liberal governments around the world.
Yes, good morning. And look, that's potentially true. Obviously, these are not popular policies that have been introduced by the United States administration. It could have quite a detrimental impact on the economy in Australia. There's going to be the direct impact, of course. We've been subject to a 10% baseline tariff, some exclusions, but they're reasonably minor. But the indirect impacts are largely unknown at this point, and they could be severe. So, very unpopular policy, and early on, I suppose, the Liberal Party did align with some of the US administration's policies to do with working from home and reducing public service, and this, of course, could have had an impact on the response of the Australian people to them.
We have heard quite a bit of commentary from Treasurer Jim Chalmers. Let's just take a listen in terms of his take on how this potentially affects Australia through these tariffs.
What we're seeing here is the impact of a series of bad decisions taken about tariffs, and the whole world is trying to get their head around the impacts on their own economies and the global economy as well. For Australia, there's really three channels that we are monitoring very closely. The overall impact on the global economy and global demand is obviously troubling.
And it seems like the most important of those channels is really the impact on the global economy, the impact on China, how that sort of blows back into demand for Australia, right? There doesn't seem to be overly a lot of concern over direct exports being tariffed to the US from Australia. Do you think that the government should have taken a stronger stance, given that they were one of the first governments to come out and say they won't be putting in place retaliatory tariffs?
Look, to be perfectly honest, I agree with that response. I don't think retaliatory tariffs would be a good response from the Australian government. And so obviously we know that tariffs are generally passed on to consumers, and it could cause short-term inflation here if that was done of any products that we import. And so it doesn't really seem to be sensible to impose retaliatory tariffs. So I agree with their responses to not negotiate on things like our biosecurity laws, though, and also our PBS was mentioned quite a bit leading up to the announcement, and both parties have indicated that neither one of these points are going to be points of negotiation.
So where do talks start? Because usually when you have trade disputes, you would go to the WTO, but we know that the Trump administration has largely sidelined the World Trade Organization.
Now, that is a very excellent question, and it's one that I've been thinking about quite a bit over the past few days, is what do we actually do from here? Because there are avenues, of course. Traditionally, international trade rules have really kept us on the straight and narrow. They've kept us very even ever since the conclusion of World War II. We've built up a degree of goodwill over this time because international trade, the rules are largely based there for people who believe that they can benefit from being part of the multilateral trading regime. Now, the United States doesn't seem to think that they do benefit from being a part of that, and so they have completely disregarded both the World Trade Organization rules, and it appears they've disregarded their free trade agreements. So the points of negotiation, I don't know where you start, because our legally binding agreements have been completely ignored.
Usually when we talk about these tariffs affecting trading partners of the United States, we are also perhaps giving some thought to these countries potentially veering towards doing more deals with China. But we know that Australia has had its own issues with Beijing. So where does it find its new markets?
Well, again, that's a very good question, and we don't know what the indirect impacts of these tariffs are going to be. Obviously, they are very widespread, and so they're going to impact on other countries, sometimes disproportionately to how they will impact on Australia, and this will impact on supply chains. In terms of finding new markets, I know this was something that the Albanese government announced would be part of their plan. And I suppose that just means working with the existing markets. We've obviously got trade agreements throughout Asia as well. And so these could be avenues.
We've talked about some of the major markets, and we have seen an increase shipments when it comes to agricultural exports to markets like China, like Japan. Unfortunately, a lot of these markets are also ones that are being targeted by the Trump administration with tariffs of their own. Are you concerned about diminishing consumer demand from those markets as a result of economic weakness?
Well, of course, there is that possibility. But if we're talking about our beef exports, for instance, then the demand for beef is increasing over time. So I don't think that's a huge concern in terms of those other markets. Our agricultural products are known to be some of the safest in the world due to our traceability schemes, which is also related to our biosecurity regime. And so I don't think there's a huge amount of concern about alternative markets for those products, or indeed whether the 10% is going to have a significant impact on the demand in the US.
Felicity, really great to have you with us. Felicity Deane, who's a professor at the Queensland University of Technology, talking trade and Australia. And we have more on Australia ahead every Tuesday. That's 11:40 a.m. if you're watching in Sydney, 8:40 a.m. if you're watching in Hong Kong. I should say that's actually 10:40 a.m. after the clocks have now changed here in Sydney. You can tune into the Bloomberg Australia podcast too. We delve into the biggest stories shaping the country's role in global business. You can find that on Apple, Spotify or Bloomberg.com. This is Bloomberg.